We are living in a time of great change, and it's critical for us to come together as one human family so that all of our grandchildren, many greats into the future, will be able to enjoy a life here on Mother Earth. May Rematriated Voices create a space within your heart and mind to join with Indigenous thought leaders and allies. We've been brought together for a reason. It's up to all of us to figure out why. Welcome to Rematriated Voices. I'm your host, Michelle Shenandoah, Wolf Clan member of the Oneida Nation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Matrilineal men are men who stand empowered alongside empowered women. They're able to express their masculinity without diminishing a woman's voice or her autonomy. On today's episode, I am joined by Chief Spencer Lyons of the Onondaga Nation Hawk Clan, Chief Brennen Ferguson of the Tuscarora Nation Turtle Clan, and Neil Powless, member of the Onondaga Nation Eel Clan. We recorded this episode on a beautiful autumn day by Blue Mountain Lake in the Adirondacks. I'm so excited to be here with the three of you. And I'm here with three of Haudenosaunee's finest. Sincerely, I mean that. You were supposed to laugh.
We knew you were serious.
Right. No, it's really wonderful. Actually, I'm joined today with my husband, Neil Powless, and with Onondaga Hawk Clan Chief Spencer Lyons and Tuscarora Turtle Clan Chief Brennen Ferguson. Now for being here today. I'm really grateful to have this conversation of what we're calling matrilineal men, which the three of you are. You have all grown up in traditional Haudenosaunee matrilineal culture. In our culture, we talk about roles and responsibilities. And I'd like to talk about the role of men, or actually I'd like you to talk about the role of men in our culture. And so I'm going to create that open space for you. Yeah.
I think when I think of when we are talking about men's roles, it comes down to oftentimes, it's a fact that men are physically stronger than women. And the question is, what are we going to do with that strength? So that's one thing that I've always been taught is that, we're supposed to be using that strength, which was something that has been given to us by creation to protect our families and to take care of our families. And that it's not even supposed to be a thought that comes across your mind to use it to abuse your family, your wife or your children. And to me, that's what I think of Haudenosaunee masculinity is having the awareness that you have this strength, but also the understanding and the compassion of using it right.
What is masculinity, and what would be Haudenosaunee masculinity?
That's a hard question. I guess you can answer a bunch of different ways. The way I think about it is, again, using our effort and our strength to kind of reinforce or enforce the will of the families. So, when our clan mothers make a decision, or even the women in our family, that masculinity is, again, having the self-control and the humbleness to go with that decision and to do what you can to help support whatever that decision is.
As a lacrosse player, it's extremely physical and demanding. It's extremely aggressive a lot of times. And so for the expression of that, it's also learning about how to control and manage that expression of aggression, and learning how to kind of really toe that line. It's a fine edge, right? It's like a nice edge. It's really sharp. And there's a moment when you can take it too far, and you have to understand what managing that space is and understanding how to utilize that expression, right? Knowing that, especially in Onondaga, you have a lot of the leadership that are chosen by the women, and the women are watching how they play the game and how they protect their teammates, how they protect their family, how they give of themselves for the greater good instead of just focusing on themselves as individuals. And so when you really think about that expression of what does it mean to be that, it's all of those things. It's the fight, it's the offense, it's the defense, it's the defense, and the maneuvering around that space, and sometimes pushing the person you're competing against to respond to that. And so it's understanding that there is a balance between aggression and understanding that balance between control and how you manage that. And so I think whether it's on the sports field within lacrosse or within the community or as a leader, like these two gentlemen here, or any other space in the home, you have to find that fine line of balance, understanding that your guiding principle is for all, and that your job is to protect all, right? For the good of all, right? That we put our minds together as one thing with a similar goal.
I really like both the responses. And for myself, I kind of go back to the cultural teachings and thinking about the original instructions. And I heard an elder describe how men should be. And in the culture, we refer to our elder brother, the son, as Hoske. Like he's the big man, Sidwachi and our elder brother, the son, and that we should be like him, that he's never relenting in his duties and what he provides, and that the elder brother, the son, every single day he does what he needs to do to fulfill his duties. And thinking about like both the responses and like men are supposed to emulate that, and we're supposed to be protectors, providers. But that goes back to kind of what Neil was talking about. Sometimes we're protecting compassion or love, or we need to be able to provide that too. And so there is that balance within what exactly is needed and asked for us, and to find that balance and make sure that we're providing that for the people, for all of our people, because we're such a communal people, and we think about all of our gifts and who we are is supposed to support the greater good of our communities in general and our people in general. So we're always using these instruments, using these stories, using things like lacrosse as an instrument to hone ourselves, and that should be making us greater people, being just a good person in order to provide that back to our communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really wonderful to hear in each of your responses. There's such a element of listening and really like gauging your behavior and looking out to, the natural world, knowing also that there's others who are watching your conduct. So, speaking of roles and responsibilities, which you've talked about a little bit, what are the roles and responsibilities of men? And maybe even highlight some of those of women. And where do we receive those instructions?
I think it's really easy to fall into I don't want to say fall into that trap, but fall into that ideology, especially when it comes to our teachings and comes to language and the way that we understand these things. Because at the end of the day, we are living in a society who has endured assimilation, colonization. And so when we're trying to dissect our understandings of the language is also alive, and it's also, it's a living thing, it's a living entity, and it changes, and it has changed over time. So when we're talking about the original instructions, when people were first made and understanding Haudenosaunee cosmology, we're talking about the clan system. And what do those roles mean, and roles and responsibilities mean when we understand and talking about the creation story for both men and women? Or what do those roles mean and those responsibilities when we talk about the clan system and the coming of the clan system, and creating a support network for each other as people with the clan system? And all of those contexts, and the context of these roles and responsibilities, and what I understand is all of those things are about evolution of Haudenosaunee culture and Haudenosaunee people over time. And all of these messages we're giving to the Haudenosaunee at once. This is what happens in Onewa Agwa, when they were off their path and they had forgotten what the original instructions were. So they introduced clan systems, and messages were brought to the Haudenosaunee, and then the Great Law of Peace, and then things like Gaihuio. But I think like a lot of the times, because of the way that we're, I guess, for lack of a better word, the way that we're institutionalized through education systems, through academia, and through assimilation and colonization, all the things that are brought to us living a reservation style life, living a reservation on reservations. We're surrounded by the outside culture, mainstream culture, so that influences the way that we understand these things, and it can change. It does change the language. But for me, I think about these things and talking about women and highlighting they're the main bosses. Like for me, that's like in Onondaga Ganaktaguanioke, we don't start ceremony until we get confirmation from the clan mothers. They give us the nod to say, okay, now. And they say, and I've heard people like my great uncle Oren talk about, well, if you want to know who holds true power in a civilization or society, it's the people that can call for war. And even in that, there's instances through historical documentation to say, well, they would always refer back to the women, whether they would allow the men to go out on what they would call a campaign or to leave the village. And so that's who holds true power. But even that word, gatsatstesa, what we say in the language power, we're always filtering that through the lens of colonization and civilization. What does that mean? Because it means something different in the language, us culturally, than it means like authority or power, and that the way that it's used on the outside. And so we're wrestling with these terms. And so for a second language learner like myself, these are things I have to take into consideration in the evolution of who we are as people. Because the other part of it is I always try to look at the humanity, like what happened to people through the evolution of those times. What were people feeling and going through the coming of the Great Law of Peace, through the coming of things of staving off assimilation and gaihuio. And another strong one is gajistakta diet is the responsibilities of the women. It means that she's going about the fire. And people have misused this idea, but in our culture, when they say kajistaya, a fire, they're talking about all of those original instructions. All of those clan families have a fire. All of those people in the councils have a fire. And so when they refer to her responsibility going about the fire, that's like overlooking the entire village, the entire community, and everything about who we are and what we call Haudenosaunee Ka. Everything that makes up Haudenosaunee is what she's overseeing when it's referring to the fire. The term fire for the Haudenosaunee is a highly political term. And that even shows up in our history with colonial and imperial entities when they say places like Pennsylvania and the wampum lot, they say we're gifting this land to the Haudenosaunee for them to have a place to put down their fire. And they're referring to this relationship, this government-to-government relationship and recognition of what fire means. And so all of those teachings, like the men, are conductors of ceremony, but it's only because the women have decided that it's become time to do ceremony. We might be the ones speaking and doing the speaking, but it's them overseeing that it's all kept straight and kept true and kept right.
Thank you.
So not to echo anything that Spencer brought up, but I agree with all those good points that he made. But I'm thinking about, this question has been brought up, time and time again, especially in different Confederacy circles and in particular the Great Law of Peace Committee. And people are always coming to the committee and like almost demanding like a list of roles and responsibilities. And what I've seen time and time again is our elders that are on the committee, some of them are still with us, some of them have passed. They repeatedly are hesitant to do that. And what they say instead is, instead of focusing on this prescription of roles, what are roles that we all have? We're at a place in time where there's so much work to be done that there's roles that everybody can fill. And, learning language, learning ceremonies, being involved in your community, being a helping hand to your family, all these things, they always bring those up first, because those are responsibilities that we all have and how we can all contribute.
Mm-hmm.
I'm inspired by what they both said, in that Spencer talked about when these messages came to us, we had forgotten what our original instructions were. And so what's going on in those times, in those spaces when we forgot? They're singular, they're focused on individual, And animals do the same things. If you look at nature, there's a ecosystem and a symbiosis of how they all work together. Even different animals will work together in that space to make that area flourish. And oftentimes humans come in and ruin that ecosystem and destroy that relationship that all of those different beings have with each other and those agreements that they made with each other. And so for me, understanding those responsibilities and those roles is for us to also maintain a relationship with all of those members within that ecosystem and not to destroy it. And the same thing goes for our family, our community. So it's not just about our roles and responsibilities as humans among humans, but it's also our role and responsibilities as a member of Mother Earth and within those ecosystems of all of those beings that make that up. Because without those beings doing their thing and doing their responsibilities and their original instructions, we no longer exist. The ant is just as valuable as important to creating the growth of the vegetables that we eat every day, as are the winds, the seasons, right? All those things create the life, and we get to enjoy that life. And so our job to bring warmth like the sun to make those things grow is to sustain them and to support their growth and evolution. And if we're doing things that hinder growth or stop growth, then we're not doing our duty, right? And so I don't know that it's the job to get granular. It's more to understand my individual role on how I can sustain this ecosystem so that it can survive for generations, not just for my own.
Yeah, thank you guys. And just kind of, when we're talking about masculinity, so it's not about the way you shake your hips when you do, the smoke dance, right? Like, or maybe it is. I don't know, right?
It is.
A component.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the way you, play lacrosse and show your arms or whatever it might be, right? But how has colonization changed? The understandings of men, masculinity for the Haudenosaunee?
I'll start and let these guys, knock it out of the park. But for me, it's profoundly changed it, right? So whether it's our ceremony, we do them differently. What we eat in our ceremony is different. How we conduct them and where, the space that we do it in, completely different. How we spend our daily lives. We drive to ceremony in a car, right? And so even how we get around and how we communicate with each other, colonization has profoundly changed the way in which we experience the world. And I think it's made it in some ways a little more difficult to maintain that ecosystem balance because of all of those things. But at the same time, we also recognize that we still have to show up and do it. As my grandfather he would say, do your best. Do the best you can. And so we show up and we do ceremony, and we do them the best we can in those moments. We still do our play the medicine game and when we can. But at the same time, we also recognize that we have among our community, like myself, athletes who played professionally, and that is certainly contemporary to be playing on a stage in front of thousands of people, right? Or even like today on film, doing things on camera to capture these things for generations to come. Those are profoundly unique and different and new ways for us to share and enjoy the culture and express our indigeneity for the world, while at the same time trying to maneuver this relationship with this ecosystem that is being asked of us to do. And so I think, I enjoy plumbing, indoor plumbing, but I also recognize that growing up as a kid, I had friends that didn't have indoor plumbing, and I would spend the night at their house, and it would be, we use the outhouse. And I know that I had friends that would stay at my house because they wanted to take a shower. And that wasn't very long ago, to think that we still had that relationship with nature. We still had that kind of connection without those influences. And so I think sometimes even our own people struggle with that balance of all of these things that now exist within the world right now, with this balance of how we still engage with all of those ceremonies and the culture and who we are and expressing that on a daily basis.
Automatically, my mind kind of goes to back in contact and we're thinking about material culture and understanding the relationship to the natural world, impacts of those relationships with those colonial entities, the coming of muskets, the coming of brass kettles, and all of those things that at one time Haudenosaunee had been connected so close to the earth and everything in the natural realm. And to see that change, like no longer are we thinking that you have to now shoot an animal with, or take an animal, harvest an animal with a bow and arrow, but then you get a musket. And what does that do to all the traditional teachings? What does that mean that you don't have to have an intimate relationship or understanding to the land or those animals to know that where they are? And there seems to me like there's a trickle effect that happens, that takes place, and it's almost very rapidly if we think about the evolution of people and civilization and how much time that really takes. And then to introduce something like that and just have this rapid change within Haudenosaunee culture, and for that to almost destabilize our understanding. And I would say destabilize, but at the same time, the things that I see is that our teachings have existed and stood against assimilation and colonization. And there's been instances in again, looking at the humanity of civilization itself and as people, and for them to be able to hold on to our teachings and to be able to pass that down from generation to generation. And it still means something for us today to call ourselves Haudenosaunee. It still means something to be able to call ourselves Onondaga, somebody from Onondaga, and knowing that now is our turn as a generation to make sure that what's being passed down is going to sustain for the next generations, and to make that meaning, and to face today's challenges, whether it's assimilation, colonization, that was faced down. They looked that in the face and they were able to sustain, and to a point where I can say those words and they mean something to our people. So that's part of that, is we have to make sure that we're meeting today's challenges, understanding that those have to be able to sustain. All of the principles and values of calling ourselves Haudenosaunee and Ongwehua are still passed down. And we have to know, like, that is alive, that part of being human is a living part of culture. Our culture is alive. And it's our responsibility now to make sure that it lasts in the future.
Yeah, you're actually reminding me of a story that I learned from a Pueblo elder, and she was telling me about how that, the women would grind the corn, and that people, just to kind of make the process go a little bit faster, started to put it into a blender. And so more recently, there's been this trend to come back to putting it onto the grinder again. And she said that what became really evident was that there's all these songs, right, and words that go along with coming in that process of grinding the corn, and that when they made that switch to putting it in the blender, then it's like the songs were not being sung, the words were not being spoken, right? And so I'm thinking about like what you're talking about with, just the element of going hunting, right? From learning how to make, your own bow and arrow, and all the teachings that you would receive from the men, from your uncles, your grandpas, your brothers, whomever it might be, right? To teach you all that goes into that, because it's not just making something to kill an animal, but yet there's this whole process and a teaching and an understanding that is imbued right into all of it, right? From the beginning process of making the element to, just full circle to being able to feed and provide for the family or your community, right? Yeah.
I think it would be easy to point at any part of our society today, and we could analyze how it's been affected by colonization and the patriarchy. But the obvious one to me that I think of quite a bit, especially when I watch like young teenagers and how they interact with each other. I can remember like in my community and hearing the guys older than me, the way that they would talk about girls, and it was really disrespectful. And we don't realize it at the time because we're young and we're learning. And so you hear it in the locker room, you hear it at school, you hear it, from your family, and you just accept it that that's probably reality. But then there's a huge contrast when we're in Longhouse and we hear the way that, the power of women is described, and in Garihuyu, when they talk about how the Creator has a really high regard for women because of their specific duties. And then this male speaker will say this, that the Creator highly values all women, and then all the men will agree. But then in those conversations, again, it's a different story. And so I think a huge thing that we could do today that would make a big impact is taking the time to teach our young men how to, live like we believe that teaching, and to teach them, that the way that they're hearing their friends talk about girls isn't appropriate, and that it's just straight up wrong. Educate them on what our own teachings say about women and how they can live their lives as if they do agree that women are as valuable as we're saying they are.
Yeah, yeah. So each of you were raised in traditional Haudenosaunee communities. And what were you taught about how to treat women? And how does that differ from what you see?
I think there definitely is a difference in what we're taught and the things that we see when it comes to, and I'll say not even just our relationship to women, but just everything really. Because for me, I was always taught to respect women, and I was actually brought up around a lot of elder women. My great grandmother was a clan mother at one time, and all her best friends were clan mothers. And my mother was a home health aide and who took care of elders. So I actually was fortunate enough to find myself in spaces where there were a lot of strong Indigenous women, but a lot of elder teachings too. I grew up down the road from another clan mother, and I was friends with her grandchildren, and so everything in our culture, we say it starts at home. And it's true. Like, I'm the oldest of four. I have two younger sisters. My mom brought us up traditionally in the longhouse and all the teachings that go with that. I was talked to and taught by a lot of elder men and elder women. And it's kind of true. It is true what Brennen had talked about before. And this difference, how we go to ceremony and we say, like, this is how it's supposed to be. And these are all the teachings that are how we're supposed to act as a human being, as a man. And then when we leave, that's not what we see. That's not the reality that we're seeing. And I myself, like, I was always taught to never put your hands on a woman and to always respect them, respect their voices and their choices. And that's sadly, because of the things that happen on the reservation life. And I look at just recently a lot of and when I say recently, the last couple of years, and how much data is being shared about the missing, murdered Indigenous women and all the reality of Indigenous women's existence. This is on territory and off territory. It's very disturbing because I was taught that, and I always tried to carry myself with that in mind, is how to be and how to talk to women, how to respect them. And then it's true, like, you have those friends, you have those uncles, you have those people that talk a way that isn't appropriate or might not be appropriate, or things that become so normalized on reservation, on territory, that are toxic, they're not healthy. And so that's the responsibility of all of us as Ungwahuma people, both men and women, is how do we break that cycle? Where do we break that cycle? Do we have the bravery? Do we have the courage to step up and take action to actually break those cycles? And that's our reality as Ungwahuma people of, I think, where we're at as a society.
I was really fortunate to be able to sit in a conversation with three other men, Neil being one of them as well. And we were having this discussion about violence that happens and how even in spaces where, whether it's locker room talk or, our lacrosse is such a big, such a part of who we are, And, yet sometimes in the locker rooms that, the conversations around women, right, can be very degrading. And, what does it take to change that? And I know that the culture is shifting, not just for Haudenosaunee, but just kind of generally for mainstream as well, being more mindful of women, being more mindful about violence perpetuated against women, right? And being able to change those narratives. And one of the interesting things that I learned was that it actually is really challenging for men to be able to be, like you said, to have courage, to be brave enough in one of those spaces to say, hey, this is not how we're going to talk about women today, because there could be some serious consequences physically for the person who speaks up that way. I'm just wondering if that's changing.
Yes and yes. So I know I don't look it, but I am a slightly different age generation than these two. And in my younger years as an athlete, and I also going to Longhouse, I heard those things about women and how you talk to women. And in my house, how I was supposed to speak to my mom and to my sister, and how those things transpire, and the authority within the household and the community, and also elders, right, teaching me those things. And then I go and play sports, and I have a coach saying different things, or I had other parents in the car on the rides saying different things or talking different ways, or then even hearing things in music and in TV and social, in social spaces. Socially, I was being introduced to media that was completely saying a completely different thing. And so as a kid, I have to be authentic in my Haudenosaunee manliness to say, yeah, that impacted how I interacted with women when I was younger. And I have to, like he said, be brave enough to say, yeah, maybe I was not one of the greatest people at another time in my life, but now I have to do all those things and extra to be a defender of those things, to make those changes, to be the brave one to stand up and say, yeah, maybe I wasn't perfect, but now, not that I'm trying to hold someone to a higher standard than I would hold myself, but be the example now for myself, for others. As a coach, I know that I had conversations with my teams, and I often coached the teen teams, because no one else wanted to deal with those teenagers, right? And I would have conversations with them about how they spoke about girls in the locker room. And so they knew, when coach is in the locker room, don't say that stuff, right? What they said when I left, probably a little bit different, but certainly when I walked into the locker room, I made sure we were pretty clear. And one of those teams had my son on it, and so I had conversations with my son. I remember when my daughter was in high school, and that was the Stanford swimmer who attacked the woman outside a bar. And I said, what do you feel about that? And she said that man should have known his life was over as he knew it the minute he touched that girl. That's what she was taught. That's how she was understood, how her being was supposed to be respected. And that meant a lot for me to hear her say that. And it meant a lot to know that she was talking to her brothers about, that's how you're supposed to be. That's how you're supposed to act. And we've had other athletes not too long ago who have also, lacrosse athletes and other communities who have engaged in behavior that have hurt women. And how do they come back? How are they going to maneuver through that space if they do decide to come back? And what would they need to do in order to make things right for their own choices and their own behavior? And I think that has to be the example, is that bravery and owning that, and then coming in and doing something different and showing that we can grow and evolve from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that is a principle that we're taught as Haudenosaunee, is making things right. So I'm just curious, how would a man, make things right who might be in a position where he's caused harm to another?
I personally think that's kind of tough to conceptualize for myself, because I think about the self and I think about ego and I think about me as a person, as a man, and who am I to define how can I make that right without addressing the person I've harmed. It to me it comes down to healing. There's a time in my own healing journey where I had to make things right for myself. Yeah, that's true. But if I impacted somebody's life, then how they heal and their journey, like they have to be able to communicate that or understand that like I'm asking for forgiveness or whatever that might look like. But what is it their needs, the victim's needs that they need for their healing? Is that like direct contact? Maybe not. Like it's up to them to, I think there has to be this give and take possibly, or this understanding that it's the responsibility of whoever I've offended to help me understand what they need for their healing. And maybe it's nothing that they need from me. And maybe it is something like a physical apology. But I don't think it would be up to the so-called perpetrator or the one doing the action as much as it would be for the one who actually needs the healing. Because on either end of the interaction, there is a healing needed, and that courage to step into a healing space to say like, yeah, I messed up or I did something or take responsibility for and accept the consequences. Can we accept those consequences? And that's life, right? That's every decision has a consequence. Whether we want to say good or bad or positive, negative, every choice there's a action and reaction, and so where is that would be up to the individual, I think, and what they need in their healing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's a equal trauma that happens. I do a lot of work in this stuff, right, with healing, in my current role, as an ombuds who's working with conflict every day, and so I lean in a lot on the Great Law, and one piece of that, which is about grief. We use the word condolence when we install our leaders, that they go through a condolence. And that's about grief. We actually have 15 stages. So it's a lot more eloquent than the Kubler-Ross grief model that has 6, right? We evolved that understanding of the process of grief and healing through that journey. And it's more than just physical. It's mental, it's emotional, it's spiritual. We talk about clearing your eyes so you can see, your throat so you can speak, your ears so you can hear. But it goes all the way through the body, your energy you leave, and all of the spaces, how you carry on your day, your weeks, your months, your years, how you revisit it back and forth. And so making it right isn't about making it right for me. You're showing up so that you can be the protector of. Tadadaho told us that through the first process with the Great Law. He was terrible. He hurt a lot of people. And then his responsibility as the perpetrator of that was to use that same strength, to use those same abilities that he had to protect all people. And so if men are going to show up in that space, then we have to become the protectors and provide the space as needed when they ask us to show up, they will tell us, ask the question, how would you like me to show up and defend you? And I will show up and defend you in that way. And do your best to do that. That's what's making it right, because you show that you're willing to learn from that and change your behavior to a new course and become the defender of that, if that person wants you to defend them. And you have to respect that might not be what they want. But you have to be willing and open to hear what that person is experiencing and how they're experiencing it, and go through that journey with them. It's not about they have to do their thing and I do my thing and we just go on. There has to be some way to work on that together. And that takes a lot of bravery to go into that space and be honest and truthful. And so men have to figure out how to heal their traumas, heal their struggles. And it's a life journey. It's a journey that you're on from beginning to end. And so it never finishes. You can only just do the best you can.
I think, when we make things right, it starts with acknowledging that you've done wrong. And I think that's a huge part of any of those processes, whether it's with your parents or a sibling or a partner that you've done wrong to. And, it's acknowledging that you either said something or you did something that you shouldn't have. And I think Neil's absolutely right. It's a two-way healing process, because it feels good to make right with somebody when you've done wrong, and then it feels good to hear somebody acknowledge it when they've done wrong to you. But to me, that's where it starts. It starts with at least acknowledging that wrong was done, and then the two of you can work out how you're going to move forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. All three of you. It's not, it may not be easy to address, but I really appreciate that, you've been very open in this way and talked about healing, right? I mean, when we hear about masculinity and toxic masculinity that's happening out in the bigger society that surrounds us, you don't really hear too much about healing. Mm-hmm. And I appreciate that you've addressed that, right? It is a healing process. It becomes one for you as a man. It becomes healing, for another person if you've harmed them, right? And so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
The perception is that if you engage in that process as a man, you're weak. And I think the thing that about going into a space into that to heal something, a trauma or a struggle, usually it's probably one of the hardest things you're ever going to do is to own up that you hurt somebody and to be honest and authentic with that. And so it's actually probably one of the more stronger things that you're going to ever do, and probably one of the hardest things that you're ever going to do is to show up in that space. So I think it's seen as being weak and vulnerable when I actually think it's really about strength.
Yeah. Oh, and speaking of strength, all three of you are fathers, and you have welcomed children into this world. And so I actually just want to ask you, what is that? As a man, as a Haudenosaunee man, what is that to welcome? Like, what is the teaching that you understand about children coming into this world? And, what is the role you have? How do you welcome children into your life?
I think the most direct way is we have a practice of fathers literally welcoming new babies into the world. We speak to them as if, they're any other person and make them aware that they're here on earth now. And I know when I've spoken to my children when they're born, I make sure that first I introduce them to their mother who had just went through this huge amount of stress and hard work to bring them here. And I tell them, hopefully you'll be of good help to her and your whole family into the future. And from there, I'll introduce this new baby to the different parts of the world and give them a little tiny bit of information about what that relationship is. And I make sure that they hear from me that, I'm their father and I'm going to be here. And I go over who their family is and their clan and their nation, so that when they first arrive here on earth, they hear those things and they won't be confused about it for the rest of their life.
And just to mirror that, I think it's really important that we as Haudenosaunee people in our traditional teachings is that's really important because it's the first language and first experience of hearing, like right directly from the womb, and all the 9 months that they've lived joined with their mother in spirit and life, and then to have this in this introduction to family, introduction, and the way that I've learned in traditional teachings that it almost mirrors the Thanksgiving address. You start with your family and their family and say, I am your father, this is your mother, these are your grandparents, clan family, and then you go work your way right through the Ganahani, Thanksgiving address, like the earth and the relationship that there will come a time they'll notice there might need medicines, and it's an introduction for that natural world also to this new spirit that's bringing here. And this happens even before the naming process that happens in ceremony and longhouse, but this is part of it. Like, the clan mother should have that name, and that name should be ready for that child even at that moment. And so that they have that, and we're setting their path, we're setting their mindset. And then from there, we're supposed to always be that example for our kids, right? And we try our best to live our lives like that. I know for myself, like, it completely changed my view of the entire world. Like, things that I never thought I would care about, or things that I never realized I did care about, all of a sudden were the most important things in the world to me. I remember driving home with my first, and me and her mom are in the car, and I was so upset with the road because the road was bumpy, and I was so worried about her health. Like, do I have the right car seat? And is she getting bounced around too much? I'm like, this darn road. And it's like things that I thought were important to me as an individual, they really fell by the wayside. And I start understanding how minuscule, or maybe even like words like how petty some things were in my life, and how I might have been giving my attention to the wrong things. And to now be a part of this child's life, and for this child to have made me a father, it completely changed the world for me in my perspective of the world. It completely changed the ideas that I had of who I was, or even what I aspired or wanted to be, or even things that I didn't even know I would become.
I'll say, even growing up in a traditional family, in a traditional household, we didn't talk about that kind of ceremony for the kids. So when my kids were born, I didn't do it, right? And for me, it's like, I wish I did, right? I wish I knew that at that time. So, I'm sure there's Indigenous people watching this like, oh man, I didn't know that, or why didn't I do that, right? And it's okay, because I was still able to infuse thought process, Indigenous Haudenosaunee thought processes to my kids as young kids as they grew up. I understood my relationship foundationally with them because I understood the ceremony, the connections, the conversations with those things. So while I didn't have that conversation on the first day, I did have those conversations throughout the duration of their young childhood. And so I can look back on it and say, yeah, I didn't do that, but I did okay, and I can still talk to them today and talk to them about it, and share the knowledge, right? What you do with the knowledge is what you decide to do with the knowledge once you have it, right? But if you don't have that knowledge in that moment, that's also okay too. We're survivors of genocide, all four of us sitting here. We're the ancestors of survivors of genocide. And sometimes we forget things. Sometimes different families didn't pass all those things down. And sometimes it didn't get to you. And that's okay. We have to be able to forgive ourselves for those moments and not hold on to that energy and say, oh my gosh. But once you know it, then you have a responsibility to give it on to this next generation so then they can pass it on from that point on. So I know that eventually my kids, when they have children, will understand what that means and what their role within that process and that journey can be after that.
Yeah. So feminism can be seen in direct opposition to patriarchy and masculinity. But from your perspective, how is rematriation different?
From what I see, and in my own community, and then also knowing you and the work that you guys do, when I think of like Western feminism, oftentimes it's, they frame it as being equal to men, or they frame it as, women can do the same work that men can do, or things along those lines. And from what I know in my community and what I've witnessed during my time as a leader, I meet with my clan mother pretty regularly, about once a week, and she'll bring a few helpers with her, and we'll just go over nation topics, family topics, clan topics, and just have a discussion about it. And sometimes I bring my own helpers as well. And what I've noticed is that, it's true that men and women think differently. And not to say that men think better than women or women think better than men. It's just we simply view the world differently. We have different experiences, and that, contributes to our own thinking. And bringing those two different types of thinking together to both contribute equally to the end result or the decision making, I feel like that's how I view kind of the work of your company here, is reasserting that process of bringing the thinking of men and women together equally.
Mm-hmm. Rematriation and rematriated spaces are about returning to the source of creation, the source of mother, and they're associated with and related to the moon and the water, and those are the things that inform women's process. And Spencer talked earlier about the sun and how informed by the sun and fire, right? He talked about fire and the value of fire and the importance of fire, and that we both have to cultivate it. And we can certainly think about times where if you have too much fire, you evaporate all the water and water ceases to exist in that space, and that's not a healthy space. And if you have too much water, you extinguish that fire, and that is also not a healthy space. And so understanding that rematriation is about finding and acknowledging that balance between fire and water, between women and men, and between all of the ecosystems around us, and that balance is about understanding how they work together, how heat and water, they work together, and how they have to coexist to have a healthy ecosystem, and they have to find that balance. And so for me, rematriation and rematriated spaces absolutely have a space for men. And they require that men show up in those spaces and participate in that process to evolve that ecosystem so it's a healthy space. If it's just women or just women's power, then there's not equality. Then it's not going to be a healthy space. They have to have those equal forces working together in unison.
Yeah.
For me, being a second language learner and a student of culture, a student of history and understanding, and when I heard rematriation even using as a term, I think about revitalization, language revitalization, cultural revitalization, and how that balance needed to be reclaimed and being brought up the way that I was brought up to see how sometimes things were swayed in one direction or the other. And I really supported that idea, and I do support that idea of rematriation, because for me, that isn't necessarily just a strictly feminine term. For me, it's a cultural term because of the way that I was brought up, the way that I understand who I am as a Haudenosaunee person, and how we understand the matrilineal society. And so it isn't strictly feminine, it isn't strictly masculine, but this balance and a reclamation of these voices and a reclamation of understanding our responsibilities as people. Mm-hmm. And that's what I see is happening in the work from rematriation and the group as an organization, is to step back into these spaces and reclaim certain spaces, but at the same time, never neglect, because at the end of the day, Haudenosaunee is Haudenosaunee. And at the end of the day, being Haudenosaunee is being Ongwahuma, being a real person. And everything in our culture is just really simple and practical about being respectful and being a good person. It's like really simple and really practical. And how we move and how we need to be able to move as Haudenosaunee people in today in balance with outside culture. Like, yeah, we do need to reclaim those spaces for ourselves as Haudenosaunee people. And I don't think that is exclusive coming from, I see that being understood from an organization like Rematriation, and I respect and I appreciate that as revitalizing and being a part of that effort into re-strengthen and making sure those teachings are strong for future generations.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much. Yeah. So I want to just take this another step further. As we're talking about language, we're talking about men, we're talking about women. Where do two-spirit and non-gender conforming people fit within the worldview of the Haudenosaunee?
As we've talked, this afternoon, we can acknowledge that there's so much work to be done with language work, ceremony work, this whole process of learning and also unlearning some things and going back to, where we're supposed to be as Haudenosaunee. And that work is real. We have hired people to learn language. We have hired people to revitalize any number of practices in the arts, in the agriculture, all these things. And there's so much work to go around, I think that there's enough work for everybody. So people that want to contribute to that work and what it means to be Haudenosaunee, the orientation, 90% of the time or even more, it's not even, the question doesn't make any sense because there's so much work to do that anybody can help. I'll acknowledge that in certain ceremonial instances, we know that there's women's ceremonies and we know that there's men's ceremonies, and that's kind of a different question. And maybe we need to address that separately. But 90% of the time, the question can be answered simply that, anybody can contribute to the work that needs to be done.
I think these conversations have been happening more and more in our communities because people are finding the space to become themselves and finding the courage, like we talked about, having the courage to step into spaces as themselves. Being somebody who is taught from a very traditional aspect, I look at the language and like I had mentioned before, there's feminine roots even to the verbs and masculine roots. When I think about two-spirit and this term was only coined in the 70s and 80s, I do believe, as some convention in the Midwest by Anishinaabe or Ojibwe person, and they brought this idea and this term two-spirit. And I think about myself as I also think about who we are fundamentally as Haudenosaunee people. And we didn't call ourselves Haudenosaunee until the founding of the Confederacy and becoming people of the Longhouse under the Great Law of Peace. Part of the principles of the Great Law of Peace are equity, inclusion, and understanding that we also need diversity. And it's so funny in stepping into my own work in some of the spaces that I work among, like academia and other colonial institutions. These three words have become buzzwords in the last 10 years or so. And it's like, wow, all right, you guys are finally catching up to the Great Law of Peace. This is who we are fundamentally as Haudenosaunee people. But when I look at traditional teachings and when it's passed down and taught to us, I always wonder to myself, and it comes down to this conversation of nature and nurture. I have respect for all forms of life and everybody. And my perspective is the same what Neil shared earlier, is the bug's life and the ant's life is equal to my life, and my life is equal to the tree's life, is equal to the deer's life. And everything that who we believe we are as Haudenosaunee is in equity with the entire natural world. And so these conversations do need to be had, like Brennen was saying, is well, how does that look? Because our culture is alive, our language is alive, and even understanding culture when we don't know what it's like they say in linguistics, unknown agent, then you always use the feminine pronoun. And if I don't know who I'm talking about or talking in general, our language leans to the feminine pronoun. We use she, and that can mean a group of people that is unknown. And then when things are very specific and I know exactly who I'm talking about in Onondaga language, then we use the masculine pronoun. But this idea of both exist and equity are right there built into our language. And I think to myself, and I think about this idea, we have a term in a way in our language when we say to think about something. We have different levels to weigh, different levels to say the word think. And there's one word, ungoya dewihta, that means to ponder, to mull it over, to really think about something, to dissect it and understand the way that things are functioning. And so it goes to me, it's that's something we need to sit down and think about. And if I look back, would it have been, if it's an idea of nature versus nurture, then maybe they didn't even make a big deal of these things. It wasn't even had to be thought about, because if we're truly Haudenosaunee people living in equity and inclusion, then if that was the work that they enjoyed and that's how they identified themselves, then that was the role that they just did. Where we find ourselves today is in need of having conversation, and how do we find the way to peace? Because the people that identify how they want to identify, and whatever terms that is, and how they want to live their life, is, if they're not in peace, then it's not fair. It's not just. It's not how we are as Ungahua people, as Haudenosaunee people. And we need to recognize that everybody has that right and responsibility to create peace among our communities. If that means having a conversation in order to make that fit, I feel like it's just so simple, just as much as it's complicated, maybe because of how mainstream culture has influenced a different generation, an elder generation that currently is the leadership in Haudenosaunee country.
Yeah.
When someone has a gift, you find space for it. Because if you're in a community and it's an ecosystem, you find a way for that gift to support the community. And so I think that's really what the conversations need to be if we're going to get into that space and talk about what those things are. And what that means is, how do those gifts then support the community and help lift us all up? And I think it goes beyond just sexual orientation. There are many different things that our communities are doing within themselves where we could certainly sit down and have conversations about how can we be living into the space of inclusion that we say that we are. And then let's think about how we're including a lot of different things within our culture that we've tended to push away as other, and how do we turn that process and look back inward and say, yes, let's include you in this conversation. Let's find a seat and a space for you and a role for you to share your gifts and participate within this ecosystem so that we are stronger together, as opposed to pushing you out and being less than because we can't find a space for you.
Mm-hmm.
I was told a long time ago, well, people know where the porch was back in Onondaga in our recent history, but they had this snow snake track, and it was going around in a circle, and they said there were guys at the snow snake track, and traditionally in Onondaga, women don't participate because there was a medicinal aspect to the snow snake game at one point in time. And to this day, for the most of our communities, women don't go to the snow snake track. But there was a woman who was still alive in Onondaga, and they were kind of heckling her as she walked by, and she challenged her. She said, "I'll throw that thing farther than any of you guys." So they were kind of like teasing back and forth, back and forth. And she took out the mudcat and she actually whipped it through there, and she tossed it further than any of them could, and she beat them. And that kind of like reminds me of this idea of like being stronger than, or having these roles, but understanding that that could be filled by either side. And even though that we have this traditional ideas and traditional teachings that are taught from generation to generation, that it's about respect too. It's about respect. And I feel like that's a key element in just mainstream society, Haudenosaunee society, is that we've almost lost this element of respect. And at the same time, we've been so desensitized to things, and we normalize things that don't belong to us as Haudenosaunee people, and that we need to be aware of all of those things, and that the way that we're stepping into the future as Haudenosaunee people.
Yeah. To bring our conversation, full circle, what is the most important lesson that you believe people can learn from the Haudenosaunee about living in a matrilineal culture?
I think that for me, it's understanding that anyone, including men, does not need to be afraid of women's inherent power and authority of creation. We all came into this space through mother. All life is birth and comes through mother. And so if we are going to acknowledge that inherent power and gift, then we acknowledge where we come from, our source, our creation space. And in order to be in our best self, we have to understand that authentic, inherent authority. And I've heard it many different ways from elders that have passed on, men and women, and I still hear it today with different ones and different ways of saying it. But it all kind of says the same thing, that when you acknowledge creation and you acknowledge source, it provides for you. The same way mother provides for you, the same way creation provides for you. And so sometimes, some people don't have that space, but they find the support of a community that helps us. So there's many different definitions of what that can become, but it's the ecosystem that supports it.
Well, just thinking about my own experience at Tuscarora and the way my clan mother and I have worked things out of how we progress work. And oftentimes we bring it back to our clan. And it's a really good feeling, especially when the young mothers bring their kids to our clan meetings, because then they're seeing this and they get to experience it. And not only that, but at the end of our clan meetings, or the last thing we do before closing, is we go around and we give everyone a chance. If they have anything else to say or any last comment or anything they want to bring up for future discussions, everybody has a chance to talk. And that includes the kids. And, it's pretty rare for the kids to talk. Usually they just hide behind their mom or they'll just say pass or something like that. But at least they know that they have the option to speak. And so I think that's something that, American society could really benefit from, is if they embrace the voice of everybody. We see it a lot, trying to limit people's voice or trying to limit the way they do it in American society with voting, limit their access to voting. And they think that that's going to make them powerful. But in reality, if more people were included in the discussion and were able to voice their opinion, then it would make them a stronger society. And I think that would be a huge takeaway.
I think for myself, I'm involved in a lot of environmental work, and I try to think about the future and the future of our people. But I see a future in the face of climate change that is going to impact all people. I mean, climate change has no prejudice, whether we're American, Canadian, people of the world, whether we're indigenous, non-indigenous. But the world is changing. And for us as Haudenosaunee people, we give agency to the grass and the trees and the medicines, and we understand that those are living entities with spirit that can understand our intentions and can understand who we are and understand our words. And we give equity to their spirits, to the water, to everything in the natural world. And I'm really concerned about how we've moved away from that as mainstream society. And for me, it's about respect. Again, like, this is a core principle of who we are as, even before Haudenosaunee, as Ungwahuma people. Being a real person, being a human being, is about respect with all things. And that's relationship to us as people, men and women, us in relationship to the natural world. And I think that there's coming a time when it's going to be exposed, the lack of relationship that people have right now with the natural world. And we're looking at all these changes. And whether we look at, and people are, we have climate deniers, and we understand that the climate has changed with ice ages and all these other things. Like, there's a natural rhythm to the world at the same time. And that us as people are impacting that natural rhythm because we've taken ourselves outside of that. For Haudenosaunee, these are things that we're always taught in ceremony, taught in traditional teachings, that we're supposed to be inside that. But even us, the way that our values and what we actually do value and how we carry ourselves in the modern world have forced us to step outside of that. And it's like, how do we as Haudenosaunee continue to live in that cycle? But also we have our traditional teachings, and I think we really need to pay attention to the relationship to Mother Earth is the first and foremost. And when that relationship is out of balance, just like when any relationship is out of balance, there are consequences for that. Our children's children are going to be living in the consequences of those, and that's what's really concerning to me. And I think that the Haudenosaunee, we have a way of life that gives us the support and the ideas and the values that our future generations are going to need. And so organizations like Rematriation, who are working in revitalization of culture and language revitalization, all of those values and what we have as outside understands institutions as Haudenosaunee people, those are going to be necessary for everybody to understand that relationship moving forward.
Yeah, appreciate that greatly. Yeah, I thank you all for the work that you do and for our people, but also for the greater world, right? This is all of us. This is like, now we're one human family, and we have to be able to conduct ourselves in a way if we want to have a future. And that's for any human being, right? Yeah. So as we're coming to close here, I just want to ask if there's anything else you'd like to share that we didn't discuss today, something that you wanted to bring to the table today. If you don't, that's okay. We can wrap up. This will probably all be edited out right here that I'm talking about. But I just wanted to ask if there was anything else.
I always want to remind people, if they hear some of these things we're talking about, and Neil touched on it, that none of us know everything. And, I can speak for myself, and I'm sure for these two, that we just did the best that we could today to kind of provide some insight. But also another key takeaway is, I want people, like we had said through the discussion, to take the time to address those young boys and those teenage boys and try to give them the information to put them on a good path. We see so many young people get lost at that time in their lives. And that's more than just the relationship to women, but, the relationship to themselves and the relationship to their family. And if you're one of these people or anybody, always remember to have compassion for yourself too. I know that, and when I was young, I made mistakes in my relationships, and, I said things or that, I had to apologize for. And that's part of that process of learning and unlearning to be a better person and to be a better Haudenosaunee person for sure.
Now we are at the end of our time together, and I'd like to say Nyawego, a big thank you for taking time to join with all of these wonderful guests here on Rematriated Voices. Spiritual leader of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Tadadaho Lyons Shenandoah, who is now in Skyworld, was once asked, if you could wish away all non-native people from this land and make it native land once again, would you do it? And he said, no, because Creator brought all of us here for a reason, and he said he didn't know what that reason is, but it's up to all of us to figure that out. Rematriated Voices was recorded on Mohawk land at Minnowbrook Conference Center overlooking Blue Mountain Lake in the Adirondack Mountains. It's a collaboration between Rematriation and Access Audio from the Special Collections Research Center at Syracuse University Libraries. It was produced by me, Michelle Shenandoah, and Jim O'Connor. Audio recording and mixing by Brett Berry at Silver Hollow Audio on Lenape land in the Catskills. Executive production assistant, Catherine Farrow. Production assistants, Jalen Jimerson, Pamela Pembleton, and Corinne Miller. Sound assistants, Griffin O'Neill and Olivia Peters. Cultural and storytelling consultants, Rachel Porter, Gudgy Junie Fox, and Neil Powless. Research assistant, Nada Mergani. Energy healer, Christina Porter. Theme song, Healing Song by Bear Fox and Teoswate. Nyawego, a big thank you to Chancellor Kent Severud, Candace Campbell-Jackson, and Patricia Delante from the Office of the Chancellor at Syracuse University. Similar thanks to Nicolette Dobrovolsky and Courtney Hicks of the Special Collections Research Center, and Aileen Gallagher and John Glass of the SI Newhouse School of Public Communications, and a special thanks to Linda Paris of the Open Societies Foundations. Vocal coaching by Joanne Yarrow of Distinctive Voices. Goyane,